Good afternoon and welcome to the Insight Teen Hour. You're listening to KHTS 98.1 FM, and it's Monday afternoon, it's 2 o'clock, and the time where we start talking about things related to teen mental health. Now, last week on the show, we had our clinical director from our facility. Sorry, I should mention I am Frederik Schulin, and I'm from Insight Treatment Programs here in Santa Clarita. It's a teen IOP program, a treatment program for kids or teenagers struggling with mental health or drug and alcohol issues. And as I said last week, we had our own clinical director from our local facility here in Santa Clarita come into the studio, and together with a therapist called Genevieve from Canoon Wellness, who was here and they addressed issues around treatment in private practice. This week, I have invited a guest into the studio who has a lot of knowledge and specialized a lot in dealing with teenagers and parents or families from a different socio-economic level families who are low-income families potentially, and he finds it extremely interesting to deal with and address and talk about how we as therapists are able to relate to some of the struggles and some of the situations that are taking place in families or with people that are from a different social class or economic class than we are, right? So today we're going to talk about that. Sebastian and I are going to go through things such as, how do you as a parent, maybe if you feel that there is a gap between what you are experiencing and you don't feel your therapist can understand you or understand some of the issues you're dealing with, how do you address that in therapy? We're also going to talk about how a therapist needs to be very mindful of a potential issue that can arise because you're dealing with families from different socioeconomic status classes in society. So that will be the chat today. But welcome to the studio, Sebastian. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. So, Sebastian, before we go into sort of all the details, I would love for you if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and the private practice that you have and what kind of families you are usually seeing in your private practice and just how you ended up in this field in the first place.
Yes. So my name's Sebastian Vasilescu. I've been a fully licensed therapist now for almost 3 years. Been in the field for about, I'd say, close to about 7, through traineeship, associate, and originally I actually wanted to go to med school. So my long-term dreams were to become a doctor and kind of really help ultimately be a plastic surgeon and help a lot of kind of disenfranchised, underprivileged communities who don't have access to kind of plastic surgery usually, right? So that was a long-term goal. I had certain kind of a little bit of health struggles towards the end of my undergrad with very bad migraines, kind of had an essential tremor in my left hand, so kind of shifted direction a little bit, after working even at a doctor's office. It just felt insurances had too much of an influence over care and treatment, even if you had your own your own practice. So my shift, because I've always been interested in psychology, I even took AP Psych in high school, I was a psych major in undergrad as well. It was an easy transition to just shift into therapy because I've always been curious about, why humans do the things that we do. What are the behavioral aspects, but more importantly, what are the kind of psyche reasons behind what we do.
Makes sense. Yep.
And after a while, started exploring options, right? I was working at the time, left the doctor's office I was working at, started working as a research assistant at Tarzana Treatment Centers on the study that UCLA was kind of conducting about Vivitrol and Suboxone, which was a more effective medication-assisted treatment for opiate addicts. So I worked there. During that time, I started my master's program, and then from there, it just kind of been a little exposure to everything as far as clients and the populations I've worked with. I worked in family preservation through Strength United. I've done in-home services there, yes, and then also group home for girls setting. So I've done a little bit there, but then most of my time has been in substance abuse treatment. Started over at a treatment facility in Woodland Hills, Harmony Place, and from there I've moved around to group private practice. Now I have my own, and back into treatment as well at a couple different places.
And that also shows me you've worked in different settings, right? Harmony treatment or Harmony, sorry.
Place.
The Harmony Place, yeah. So high-end residential program for women especially, I think. Or in the old days, at least, it was for women only, I think. No, that's not correct, actually. No, whatever. Point is that it's
Not sure about the history, but yeah.
It's the higher, some private pay involved. It can be pretty expensive.
Woodland Hills, yes.
Woodland Hills, right? Beautiful property and great clinical care. To Tarzana treatment, which is obviously the complete opposite,
yes.
right? Where they really put a lot of emphasis in helping, sort of the underprivileged population and take Medi-Cal, and it's county funded, and they do an enormous amount of great work with sort of the low income population. And so you've tried both spectrums, you could argue.
Yes, I've been a little bit all over the place. Group private practice setting, kind of where I was at was in City of Industry, so not overly affluent population that we worked with, but we had some clients that were a little bit more well off, other clients that were, majority of them were pretty much working class, middle class clients, and then we had some low SES clients as well. So that kind of provided a little bit more access to a variety of client populations as far as income levels. So that really helped. And now in private practice, oddly enough, I just had a conversation with a couple master's students that I used to teach who are now associates, talking about the rates that therapists are charging right now,
yes,
and where they're at, and a lot of them are over 200 an hour.
It's expensive these days, right? There's a huge demand for mental health providers in general, right? In the schools as well as in the public sector, even in the private sector. There's such a demand that prices change quickly at the moment, and
absolutely, yes.
Unfortunately, a lot of clinicians are getting out of the in-network agreements with the insurance companies.
Yes.
It can be very difficult these days to find a clinician in private practice who's able to take your insurance, and that's not a secret. And personally, I don't think it's going to be any different anytime soon, because there's such a need, right? I heard this morning actually on KBCC on the radio that 28% of all vacant positions within the public counselors 28% of counselors looking for work or job ads were vacant right now within the public sector. So they're doing an enormous amount of work to find people that can apply for these positions, right, and provide important services. But anyway, sorry.
No,
but it's part of what we're going through in our industry right now, right?
There are quite a great deal of clients who are looking for services, and for a long time, the field has kind of come about with different explanations, such as like the minority resiliency model, explaining that a lot of minorities are more resilient to certain struggles, and therefore that's why certain mental health disparities aren't as prevalent, or we don't see them, or why they may not come to therapy, because they're more resilient to kind of life factors, that's why they don't come to therapy. But also at the same time is, what kind of services have we provided in the past to a lot of these populations, and did they feel welcomed? Did they actually want to come back? Because if they felt, the therapist didn't understand, or the therapist just was not capable of connecting to some of their struggles, then why would you want to come back and pay, for services that, in your mind, you're like, well, I'd rather spend that money towards food or bills or something else that's, kind of more basic needs.
Absolutely.
And that's, what I feel has been maybe more likely the case for why certain marginalized communities haven't been seeking therapy as much as maybe middle class or kind of higher SES individuals have been. And we do know most people who actually go to therapy and are able to be in therapy for maybe a long, extensive period of time are those who have funds to do so.
True.
Right. So, and unfortunately, do they maybe have better outcomes because they're able to have more than 12 sessions or whatever insurances maybe sometimes approve? Or, if let's say you don't even have insurance, how many Medi-Cal therapists are there really, and how overwhelmed are they?
But you're also bringing up an interesting point, right? And that is therapy has a lot to do with how you relate to your therapist, right? Do you trust your therapist?
Absolutely,
Can you
yes.
create a relationship? I'm not saying that obviously a therapist should not be your best friend, but there needs to be a certain amount of respect between the two parties, right? Especially, of course, from the client's point of view, so that you will follow the advice and trust them to go through and change things up. And I do believe what you're saying, right? That we need to be, as therapists or mental health provider, we need to be extremely mindful of how we create that bond, even though that we could be coming from two different socio-economic levels, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So, what would you say, sort of your experience from working with different families and different kids? What do you feel is sort of the most important place to start? When it comes to, if you do have a client, or if you're as a parent and you're working with a therapist where you feel this therapist is from Beverly Hills and has no experience or no understanding of what I'm going through, where do you usually where would you start on all that?
So, kind of like what you brought up and mentioned, the therapeutic relationship is very important in the process to begin with, right? And we know this. Common factors research has shown that that and a social support system outside of therapy are the two largest indicators of change for therapy, right? So, initially, it would be to very much so focus. Can you establish a relationship that you feel some sense of trust or safety within? The dynamic, right? And in part, that's not just the client's responsibility or the family or the parents, that are seeking services, but that is, I may even argue, ultimately is more of a responsibility for the therapist to be aware of, right? So, kind of, I fall back on certain aspects of different theories, but one that really stood out for me was this notion of therapist needs to win the battle for structure. And in that sense, it's not, that's very strong language to use, but it was done with intent. And I believe what Carl Whitaker was trying to argue there is it is the therapist's responsibility to create a dynamic within therapy where they're setting the tone, they're creating that sense of safety, trust, right? And they're the ones that possibly are also attending to some of these topics that usually are not attended to, right? Kind of there's the cliche statement, we don't talk about politics, money, religion, stuff like that in the U.S., or oftentimes it's not something you bring up at the dinner table or at, holiday parties. And I don't know if it's just my nature because I've done so. I mean, I was at a Christmas party not too long ago, a couple years ago before the COVID situation happened, and I was talking about topics that were a little bit not Christmas conversations, right? And people at the party said, why are we discussing this? We're here to have a good time and enjoy ourselves. There's no need to talk about these things. So I don't know if it's just in my nature to kind of ruffle feathers, but I think it's necessary to talk about this. At least on the therapist end, we should be bringing up some of these things. I mean, it's very evident, right? Let's say if you're a Beverly Hills therapist and you're seeing a family that has been struggling paying their bills. This is evident. This is something that arguably at some point they probably brought up that I was late on rent again, or I was unable to pay, my water bill this month, or, I'm working 3 jobs and I'm still, not able to buy my kids, Christmas presents, whatever the case may be, right? These things are made very evident and clear. And what we do know also from research that has been done fairly recently, and it's still not enough, but if therapists is acknowledges this very explicitly and is very direct with attending to this, clients oftentimes will feel more seen. They'll be more able to be receptive to therapy and the process, whatever that may be, regardless of what theory the therapist uses, but they're receptive to it. And there are more positive experiences that they have in therapy, as well as there's better outcomes to therapy, right? So, and I mention this specifically in regards to attending to class and, kind of classism that oftentimes a lot of maybe low SES clients are facing. Because is it really that they don't know how to financially manage their finances, or do they not have enough resources to really be able to manage their finances, right? And I'm not sure who mentioned this, but it was I'm not sure if it was a author or a poet, but it's long have the rich spoke about how the poor should,
Yes,
or
very
what
true.
should or should not be done on their behalf, or how they should or should not be living. And it's like, who are they to really mention? If you've never experienced poverty or you've never been in that position, how can you really understand what's going on? So that kind of goes back to the point of, if this therapist doesn't understand, right, what it means to work a minimum wage job, and even that not be enough, right, to meet basic needs, then can they really understand the struggles that this client is facing? And arguably, is it really mental health struggles that they're facing, or is it other factors that they're dealing with that have nothing to do with their mental health? Is it their depression or their anxiety that they're struggling with? Or is, some of these clients who are labeled as, in particular, young boys who are of minority backgrounds, who are labeled as oppositionally defiant, and that label sticks with them, forever. And how many of those young men or young boys that become young men do we see incarcerated or end up in jail, or interacting with the legal system in some way? And so it's problematic on many different layers to not attend to this. So on the parents' behalf, if they're aware of this, I do encourage them to bring this up, right? To see if their therapist is even capable of attempting to bridge that gap, or speak on these issues. Because if the therapist is not even capable of doing that, then it might be time to find a different therapist. Which I do encourage clients. You do have that power. You're not tied down to a therapist. For a lot of them, I know it's difficult because, let's say, there's not many other options, so they're stuck to that one.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously one of the things, right, in our industry, is that, again, back to the idea, there's just not enough resources to, the medical client base, right? The people that are struggling, they can't pay out of pocket. There are very limited choices. And unfortunately, often when you finally do find a therapist or a counselor that is able to work with you with your insurance, or with the medical insurance, or no insurance at all on
Absolutely.
a pro bono basis, then you feel lucky that you just found somebody, right? And you don't want to ask too many questions or be too critical,
Yes.
because you don't have many options, unfortunately. I think we have to go into a quick little break here, Sebastian, but we'll come back.
Yes.
And we'll talk more about how this whole thing will affect your relationship with your therapist, and what the therapist can do to sort of, or what questions you can ask as a parent or a client. So hang in there. You're listening to KHTS 98.1 FM, and this is the Insight Teen Hour. That's every Monday between 2 and 3 p.m. And I'm Frederik from Insight Treatment Programs. Good afternoon and welcome back. This is the Insight Teen Hour on KHTS 98.1 FM. And in the studio today, I've got Sebastian from Private Practice. And Sebastian and I are talking about, how do you manage a relationship with a therapist who maybe is from a different social class than you are, or how does a therapist manage the relationship with a client who's maybe from a low-income family, or who where they haven't had the same upbringing, and they're not struggling with the same sort of things related to the financial situation, right? And Sebastian, I would love to hear a little bit more about. So you mentioned before, hey, as a therapist, we can disclose certain things and we can talk openly about maybe our experiences in life,
Mm-hmm.
or where we come from, what so to create that relationship, right? But I am from Inside. At Inside, we often talk about these things because, we have therapists or clinical directors who would never disclose anything about their private life.
Mm-hmm.
They feel that, hey, this needs to be on a professional basis. That could be. And then we have other clinicians who would say, no, I'm building up a relationship
Mm-hmm.
by disclosing some of my own mental health struggles, maybe my upbringing. So obviously, everybody is different.
Mm-hmm.
And I certainly am not here in the studio today to try and figure out what is the right thing to
Yes.
do and what's not. I don't want, but I would love to hear your sort of perspective of what do you feel with the experience you have today, and sort of being a person who's very into this and mindful
Mm-hmm.
of how to deal with these kind of things. What would be your recommendation, or what is your personal opinion on where to find that happy balance, so to speak?
So I usually kind of fall back on trusting some of your own clinical judgment in the therapy room. So even when I work with associates or trainees on the supervision level, I kind of defer to the fact that they're the expert in the room, right? So even though I may have not been there, uh, they had that experience with the client, right? They're in there, they're sitting across from this other human being, right? So if you're gauging that disclosing something could be helpful to the relationship that you're establishing with whether it's the individual, the family, the couple, right, then it could very much so be helpful to that relationship. There shouldn't really be an issue disclosing certain things, and I don't think you become completely an open book and disclose things that may not be necessary for a client to know. But there's definitely things that I've shared with clients in regards to certain struggles that maybe I've experienced um, to let them know that they're being understood
Mm-hmm.
on some level, right? And not to say that just because I had this struggle, then I understand what they're going through. I could relate to it, right? And see, I kind of fall back to this because it's common within the recovery community. A lot of clients, or a lot of individuals who are sober or trying to stay sober, they can relate to one another, right?
Mm-hmm.
They share certain stories like I've been through that and the way that you have, or I've done this, right? But are they understanding one another,
Mm-hmm.
right? So it's great that we can relate to one another, but understanding one another is it's quite difficult, because that means you actually have to sit with possibly someone sharing different values and beliefs than you are, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't mean you have to say your values or beliefs are more right than your clients, because you're the therapist, and so you're the one who determines what good mental health is, right? And that's one of the critiques I have about just the field in general, is like, who are we to determine what good mental health is, especially for certain populations, right? Are we actually attending to the fact that our own value systems, right,
Mm-hmm.
are playing a fact in this, right? So your own views on social class, your own views on class, your own views on race, gender, sex, right? All of this is carried with you into therapy. They're not. We know this, right? So there is quite a bit of research to show that there is no value neutrality in therapy, right? So there is a value in escapability. We bring these into the room. So some therapists I know have mentioned it's like, oh, I leave my values in a backpack outside the room. Well, unfortunately,
That doesn't happen in real life.
no,
No,
that's not
no.
the case.
No.
Right? Whether you're and this is kind of the self-therapist work that I usually kind of encourage a lot of people to do, especially young therapists, not young as an age, but in experience. This is important work to do, to attend to some of this, because if you're not aware of it, then you're not able to really notice how you possibly may be influencing clients,
Mm-hmm.
or influencing a certain population that, or populations that are marginalized in certain ways, into falling into what you view as good mental health
Mm-hmm.
or the right way for them to live. And we're all human. We're not capable of being void of biases, right? So we are biased in some way. But if we're not aware of them, then we can't attend to them, right? So if we're not at least sharing some of these things with clients where maybe that's helpful. Maybe they realize that I can't work with this therapist, and that's important for them to know, right? Otherwise, I'm also very biased, right, to speak on biases, that in my approach, I believe there's a lot of unconscious communication that's going on in the therapy room, right? And that's just because of my theoretical orientation. But there's a lot of things being communicated that we're not saying.
Of course,
Right?
clearly.
So
Yep. I agree with you.
that being the case, clients notice some of this, right?
Yeah.
So if you skirt away from certain issues, they're very, very. One mistake no therapist should ever make is to believe that clients are stupid, or they don't have certain insight or awareness. They might know more than we think,
Mm-hmm.
right? They know.
Yep.
So showing some respect to them in that scenario is very important.
Mm-hmm.
So be appropriately open on certain topics, right? If it's something that client has addressed in the past and you feel it's helpful to the relationship, then I don't think there's anything wrong with sharing that. And now, you don't give clients your home address, right? So for them to stop by whenever they want. But
Now, Sebastian, now that we talk about teens, look, I personally have my opinion on it, but I'll try and leave that outside of the room here and just ask you, what do you think? So, is there a difference between teens and dealing with adults when you talk about this kind of stuff? Meaning, when you talk about self-disclosure, when you talk about where to set that boundary, when you talk about how to build that relationship with the teen versus an adult, or where you would go with it. Do you think that there's a difference, or would it sort of be the professional who's going to find, hey, it doesn't really matter whether it's teens or adults I work with. This is the way I'm going to approach it.
I think in certain ways, possibly it shouldn't matter, but at the same time, right? Teens or children, they're I don't want to say they're more innocent, but
Mm-hmm.
they haven't maybe been through as much life as adults have. So if they can feel somewhat emotionally and on an appropriate level have a connection to a therapist because of certain self-disclosures that a therapist made, I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. And, again, there are boundaries that are necessary, right? So as far as therapy being arguably productive, there needs to be certain boundaries. Like going back to that battle of structure, the therapist needs to set certain boundaries as I'm not your friend, right? I'm not
Mm-hmm.
your buddy or whatever the case may be. I'm here to help you. And they may question, right? And I think oftentimes a lot of teens question whether you truly care,
Absolutely,
right?
100%. Yep,
They're gonna
I
be
agree.
like, why does
Yep.
trying to make sure not to slip and say certain language that teens would use, but they
Yeah. Why
why
would I care what you
yeah,
say? Absolutely.
or he doesn't really,
Care for me.
yeah,
He's just doing his job, and
or he's here because he's getting paid, right?
exactly.
So that they have and see, that kind of goes back to the fact we all interact with class on some level, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we can't separate that from therapy, right?
No.
There's money involved on some level, whether insurances are paying or it's private pay, right? So they're aware of this, right?
Yeah.
So in their eyes, oftentimes it's like, this is just another job, right? And for certain communities or populations, for a long time, are they still seeing therapists as part of like social services? Or
Interesting. Yeah,
right?
you're right.
So
Yeah, good
because
point.
oftentimes a lot of them, let's say some of the interactions I've had, the first person that they interact with prior to a therapist being in the picture is a social worker,
Mm-hmm.
right? So whether maybe DCFS first got involved, they've interacted with that system, or that quite a powerful system, right? They
Mm-hmm.
have quite a bit of influence over some of these
Absolutely.
families' lives,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So do they interpret us as just another tool as far as kind of dictating their life, Right?
Yep.
Because, like, a social worker comes in, tells them what they need to change or what they should or should not be doing, etc. So now is the therapist just another individual who's going to do the same thing?
Yep.
So if you're able to establish some, I think, there's an appropriate emotional connection that should be established within therapy too. Now, that doesn't mean you allow for, again, attachments that may be harmful to a client, right? Because now if they're overly attached to you and on an emotional level even, can you actually do any therapeutic work? Arguably, no, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at the same time, that needs to be mindful. So it's kind of a, to kind of use language, again, that is a little bit therapeutic in nature. It's like remaining differentiated is important as a therapist to kind of adjust when necessary, right? So now, does it feel like the relationship is becoming too much of a friendship, or now it's readjusting, right, and kind of
Yep.
going back to maintaining some of that structure that is necessary, right?
Some of the boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
of course. But there's no doubt about it. I mean, we also see that at Insight, right? That in the beginning, when the teens come in, it is very important that they meet peers and therapists or counselors, right? That they feel that they can relate to.
Absolutely.
And there is a certain amount, for sure, there is a certain amount of self-disclosure that is encouraged from Insight's point of view to our therapists and our counselors, so that the kids feel, hey, look, this counselor or this therapist here, he actually sort of does understand what I'm going through. There is a certain element of, yeah, he or she has been through some of the same things, or can at least relate to some of the things that I'm struggling with. I do absolutely think that that's important. So interesting. Well, how far, then I'll ask you another little question. So to a parent out there, or even a teenager out there listening, like, how far would you go? Would you encourage people to go and say, hey, Sebastian, before we start this conversation, tell me a little bit about your upbringing, or like, before I sent my teen over to see you, could you please self-disclose a little bit about your, like, how far would you encourage people or clients to go asking their therapist about some of the things that they feel are important for their therapist to be mindful of, or have experienced in their lives?
So I think that it's it's more important to kind of maybe carry a little bit of a critical lens to some of that, to interpret what would be appropriate to disclose. But let's say if you have a client who identifies as being transgender, right? And they have many other struggles on top of that. Like, let's kind of add to some of those difficulties that they're facing. You wouldn't want them to be in a room with a very Christian therapist who's possibly, now they have their own right to do so, as they carry a little bit more conservative values or beliefs. Would that be a good fit for that client? Or could that be harming even, right? Because does the therapist slowly begin to, and we know this from research, right? Clients begin to slowly take on the values and beliefs of their therapist. So if a therapist is not on the other end, right? Let's say if the therapist isn't doing their part to make these very clear and evident, to allow at least a forum for these to be discussed, so that it's not just I'm slowly kind of influencing these individuals I'm seeing to become more and more, let's say, their worldview becoming more and more like my own as a therapist.
Got it. Yeah.
So there's things like that I think are definitely important to be disclosed, right? Now that doesn't, trying to remain a little bit unbiased, that doesn't mean that we should be shaming some of these therapists, but I don't know if the individuals who are very, very conservative or rigid in certain ways are going to be helpful.
Yeah. Do you feel that there needs to be a certain amount of what's that called? Yeah, there needs to be a certain amount of balance there.
Yes.
Right. Can't be from one extreme to the other.
No.
Okay.
And I know that using some of these language like conservative or liberal is, they've been politicized, right? But there's also research that shows, based off neuroimagery, there is a conservative brain and there's a liberal brain, right? Conservative brains are very much so prone to being, their amygdala will take over at times. And so then they're vulnerable to things like fear, anger, and certain emotions to override any logic. And that's not because our emotions are just some base reptilian aspect of our being. For many of us, we haven't actually had an opportunity to interact with our emotions on a logical level, right? So our prefrontal cortex never connects to any of these emotions that we're having, so we have different experiences. So that's why they argue a conservative brain is just very much so vulnerable to some of this. And unfortunately, there's a lot of let's say jobs that people do, and a lot of those individuals who hold those positions, whether it's police officers or maybe even social workers, some of them do have conservative, what would be labeled as a conservative brain.
But just to make it clear, when you talk conservative, it's not a conservative political. It's not a
No,
political.
I mean,
it's just a word that's being used
by neuroscience
by neuroscience for that kind of brain.
And the reason they label it as conservative is because they're not capable of holding maybe conflictual views to sit with and interpret and not become too reactive, let's say emotionally, right? So that's why not giving an excuse for some of the mistakes that certain individuals have made, but if you're very much so on edge and you're always overwhelmed by your amygdala because you're in a constant state of fear, then you're going to react poorly when you see someone that looks suspicious.
Yeah.
Right.
Now and then, I know we need to go into a break soon, but I would love to. I mean, you obviously working at Tassana, right? You've worked with a lot of underprivileged populations. You've worked with a lot of families and kids there. What do you think? Like, how do we? I know this is sort of more political. No, I wouldn't go into the political scene. But how do we make sure that we have enough services available for the population? Do you have an opinion on this, Sebastian? Like, because I'm sure you see out there, there is such a big need, right? And there is not enough services to be provided for everybody. And what is your opinion on that? How do we make sure that everybody right now can get mental health support and treatment?
So in part, I think it's very hard not to be political.
Okay, then let's not go there. I don't want to make it a political show. I'm thinking more in a practical sense. Like, what can we do? Sort of, how can you and I, in our maybe daily life, or what can we do? How can we better ourselves to
I think as individuals we can make certain steps, but it needs to be kind of a collective approach that the field is deciding to attend to some of this in a way where we need to be let's say conscious of the fact that is it doable to only have clients that pay us $200 an hour or more, right?
Got it.
Or do we have to collectively as a field create an environment again which people will say, well, this sounds socialist, or this sounds whatever language they want to attribute to it, but we do need to as a field, maybe rethink some of these things.
Are we educated enough to be able to handle it? Like we talk a lot about how you need to be able to have understanding of what a very low income family is going through. Like, do we have enough focus in education on this fact so that we're actually capable as providers to support?
Based on current research and even what I've kind of gathered so far from my own dissertation, I don't think we do. Most therapists are not aware of their positionality when it comes to class, so they don't even really explore their own beliefs, values when it comes to, again, social class.
Interesting. Yep.
So as a result, I think that's why we touch on it, we interact with it a little bit, even from the people I've interviewed for my dissertation, they do touch on some of these, right, every now and again in sessions. But it's like, I don't really spend too much time regularly thinking about this, right? So we don't, right? And in part because we can't separate mental health from capitalism either.
No, makes sense. Well, and on that note, I think we need to go into a quick little break here in the end. But you're listening to the Inside Teen Hour here on KHTS 98.1 FM. And in the studio here, I got Sebastian Vasilescu.
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 Yes.
There we go. Thanks for bringing in your expertise here. But we'll be back in a few minutes. And this was the Inside Teen Hour. Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Inside Teen Hour. This is Frederik from the IOP. Sorry, from Inside Treatment, a teen IOP here in Santa Clarita. And in the studio today, I got Sebastian Vasilescu.
Vasilescu.
Sorry, Sebastian.
No, it's
Second
okay.
time, but I'll get better before the show ends. I am, Sebastian, we were talking, you're an LMFT, you got your private practice, you've done your dissertation on, sort of the difference in the social economic level and how it is to deal with families that are from maybe a lower income of the society. And Sebastian, I would love to hear, you said here in the last segment, you said that we were probably not therapists and counselors and stuff, were maybe not mindful enough of how important it is to be mindful about the social economic difference, right? With your clients. How would you recommend that we educate ourselves or become more mindful of it and as part of our support to low-income families?
So the somewhat, unfortunate or unpleasant answer I have to give to many therapists is there's a lot of reading that we have to do outside of maybe what our master's program had, or even for those who have gone on and gotten a PhD or PsyD, there might be readings that you have to do externally from what you have for your coursework. Much of the readings I've done to kind of allow some of this knowledge that I have, and by no means do I think I'm an expert in it, right? I still have a long ways to go before I can even come near feeling that way. Have been readings outside of what was textbooks or what were articles given by the professor. There was only really one course that I had, and it was an elective, which was a course called Critical Family Therapy. And my professor, who's also my dissertation chair, Dr. Dodras, really pushed for this class. And now there was both master's students and PsyD students in the class. And then initially, some of the master's students did say they were a little bit intimidated. It's like, we're sitting here with doctoral level students, and we're maybe in our first or second year. They're still kind of trying to figure out, some of this for themselves. But that was the only course that I think directly, in depth at least, or tried to give us readings on race, gender, politics, religion, class. Class was big, right? And there was one, if not the only one, that was centered to attend to these issues, because it was based off critical theory, which is started by psychotherapists and philosophers in Germany prior to World War I and after World War II, who were attending to, let's say, integrating Marx's ideology into more of present day. It's like, okay, so maybe Marx had something going for him, but what if he was missing certain things, right? So have an appropriate critical critique of our society, which means we have to attend to all of this. So even in therapy, I believe we have to attend to all of this, right? As a therapist yourself, you're not, there's no way you cannot be a political entity in the room, right? Because you bring some of your own views. And clients are aware of this, right? Again. So I think we have to do a lot of our own reading. Programs, on the other hand, can begin to switch focus a little bit. But that's hard because also some of this is requirements that BBS and other agencies or governing bodies dictate. So it's hard. It's almost saying like there might need to be a little bit of a revolution in the field because we have definitely steered away from what some of these great thinkers that established the theories that we all use, what they were hoping for. And a lot of them left in the 90s. This is known. A lot of them at some of the last conferences said, that's it, we're kind of done with the field. We're going in a direction that we don't feel is appropriate. And that was around the time that we became part of managed care.
Interesting. Yeah. That's a whole issue in itself. Don't get me wrong. It definitely changed our industry in a big way. Sebastian, before we end, I know that the hour is almost up, but before we end, if somebody out there has sort of listened to this, to the show and feels interested about some of the things you've said and would like to talk to you about maybe seeing you in your private practice, or how would they get hold of you? Can you tell us a little bit about?
So there's a couple different ways. There's my Psychology Today profile. So it's just, if you Google my first name and last name, and that should come up, as well as an email, which is sebastianmft@gmail.com, and that's SEBASTIAN There's also my phone number, which is my work number, which is arguably the easiest. You can call and leave a voicemail there, which is 818-794-9189. I encourage a lot of people to take a look at my Psychology Today because they could read a little bit about me. Now, it might not give you the full picture, but it gives you a little bit of an insight.
Gives a little bit of a profile
of. And on there, I have my rate, which is $125 to $150 an hour. I haven't adjusted it at all since I got fully licensed. That might shift, but I do sliding scale. And to be completely transparent, most of the clients that I've been seeing are anywhere between $50 to $75 range.
Great.
In private practice, right? So I have definitely
That's affordable rates in our industry these days, I would say, right? Good. Thank you very much for joining the show.
Thank
I
you
really
for
appreciate
having
it.
me, yes.
And tune in next Monday at 2 o'clock to KHTS 98.1 FM, the Insight Teen Hour.